Welcome to this new venture as we begin to look at the background to the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, and think about many things that can help us to understand the Bible better. Now I'm going to start with some very basic things because I don't know where you're starting from, but I'm imagining that you are a person who's just come to faith and you pick up the Bible and it's a big book and you have no idea where to start reading. You don't know where to find any of the books. You don't know how to make sense of the order in which the books are included, where they came from, who wrote them. And you may have some help from friends who will say, oh, well, I would start reading John's Gospel if you've just come to faith. That's great. But at some point or other, you're going to have to approach the Old Testament. And let's start by thinking about how the Bible is constructed. It's not a haphazard gathering of books. It is very ordered and very orderly. So first of all, you probably know already that there are 66 books in the Bible, written by some 35 to 40 different authors. We're not quite sure about some of the books who wrote them, but at least 35 different authors. And this is one of the mysteries about the Bible, that so many different people can write over a period of some 4,000 plus years, and yet the integrity of the book hangs together, and different parts of this wonderful book refer to other parts and support other. It's the more you know about it, the more amazing it is as a collection of books. 66, as I say. Sorry, that was my phone. I'm going to turn it onto silent. 66 books in the Old Testament and in the Bible, and there's a good way of remembering how many are in the Old Testament and how many in the New. There are 39 in the Old and 27 in the New. And if you do a bit of maths, that doesn't make any sense, but it helps you to remember. 3 times 9 is 27. 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, making 66 in total. The Old Testament covers some 4,000 years. There's about 320 or 30 years, roughly, between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. Quite a lot of things happen in that period of time. And I hope during this course to have a session when we fill in what happened in what's called the intertestamental period. And it is, let's look at the Old Testament first of all. The New Testament covers about 100 years. So it's a much shorter period of time. The Old Testament is arranged historically to begin with, and then we have the prophetic and poetry books. But it's neatly arranged in groupings 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then there are 12 books of history, Joshua, Judges, Ruth and Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther. And then we have 5 books of poetry, which is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And then we have 5 major prophets, what's called major prophets, which is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel and Daniel. And then there are 12 minor prophets. Now, major and minor there just simply refer to, it's just a way of separating the two groups. They're not really more important than the others, although I would say probably Isaiah and Jeremiah are always regarded as the great prophets of the Old Testament. So there is an order in the Old Testament. And if you know what kind of book you're looking for, like Psalms is one of the poetic books, you'll find that. You won't find that in the history section. You'll find it further on. And then in the New Testament is ordered. It has the 4 Gospels, first of all, then the Acts, then all of the letters written by Paul, grouped mostly by length in order from Romans through, and then sort of his books, his letters are divided into those 2 villages and towns and groups of Christians and those 2 individuals. And then there are the letters by other of the writers of the New Testament, like Timothy and Peter. And then the last 4 books were written by the Apostle John. That's John 1 John 1, 2 and 3, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and then Revelation. So you can find what you're looking for if you know what type of book it is that you're looking for. So that 5-12, 5-5-12 pattern for the Old Testament is wonderfully organised. So that's how things are put together. There are ways of remembering the books of the Old Testament. We might call them mnemonics. I can never say that word, mnemonics. But most Bibles do have an index. Well, they all do have an index at the beginning to show you where to find things. But there are, for some of the more difficult ones, for example, the five books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they, a former brother in the Lord, devised various ways of remembering, and he imagined that you lived in a house and your next door neighbours were green elephants. So green elephants live next door. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. If it helps, it helps. And the next group, the history books, the 12, he devised an imaginary scene where Joshua, Judges, Ruth and Samuel, because the King's Chronicles were written by Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther. A sentence that just links it all together. And the poetic books, Joe and Sam provide Eccles cakes for Solomon. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. If it helps, it helps. And then there's just the 5 major prophets, which you simply have to learn, really. That's more difficult to link. And then the way I remember the minor prophets, there are 12 of the minor prophets, is to remember them in groups of 3. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Just to remember in 3s so that you can easily find where they are. So it all sounds very simple, but the difficulty comes when you try to understand the history of the Old Testament and where the prophets came in. Most of the 12 minor prophets and the major prophets were written much later in the history of the people. In the kingdom period, the period of time after David became king and then his descendants were on the throne and the people of Israel drifted further and further away from God, and prophets were sent to them by the Lord to bring them back. And I think the hardest thing about the Old Testament is fitting those prophets into the stories. So thinking about the Old Testament, the beginning of the Old Testament is quite easy. Genesis simply tells the story of the creation, followed by the generations that were born, first of all to Adam and then to his descendants. And then it marks the flood and what happened after the flood and the people who lived after the flood and the things that they did and everything. And it's quite straightforward. There are no other books to fit into that at all. And so Genesis is quite easy because you don't have to add anything into Genesis to understand Genesis. But once you get into the period when the children of Israel were in the wilderness wandering, Then you have the giving of the law. You have the Leviticus, which tells all about the sacrificial system and all that sort of thing that was introduced once the tabernacle was built. And those books you have to make sense of, because Deuteronomy is literally the second giving of the law. It's a second account of the law. So it repeats quite a lot of what's in Numbers, but it expands on it and gives us stuff that we wouldn't otherwise know. And 1 and 2 Chronicles covers largely the same period of time as 1 and 2 Kings, but it looks at it all that time from a different point of view, from a spiritual, priestly point of view, rather than from a historical, this is what this king did and this is what that king did point of view. So understanding the Old Testament is very important, and understanding the history. And my second session, we will be looking at the broad history of the Old Testament and how things fit in and what actually happened. But I want to close this first session by saying, if you want to, the wonderful thing about the internet is that you can go over this again and again. And I do apologise for the times when I hesitate or when my phone interrupts, but I'm not into making a professional video or anything. I'm just into being your friend, journeying with you and helping you to understand the Bible better. And I hope you will receive that in this way. The last thing I want to say about the Old Testament history is that it's marked by 2 major events, both of which begin with an E. And the first is the Exodus out of Egypt, when God set his people free from their slavery in Egypt. And the second is the exile. That's when the people of Judah, Israel and Judah, went into exile for 70 years. The Exodus and the journeying through the wilderness lasted for 40 years, and the exile lasted for 70. And these are the 2 major events that the whole of the Old Testament is shaped by, and of the 2, the exile is much more complicated, much more difficult to understand, and we will be looking at that quite thoroughly. Well, I hope you'll have enjoyed my session and that you'll come back for more. God bless. Bye-bye.